Back to period 7 of the APUSH curriculum. Today we've got key concept 7.3.3. It's going to be all about American participation in World War II. So remember, we were watching these out of order this unit, but the very last video actually lines up with the very last part of the concept outline. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at and what you have to keep in mind here is that because this is American history, not world history, we're going to be pretty much just focusing on the US's role in the war. So what that looked like back home on the home front, what that looked like in kind of the outcome and the causes and effects and everything in between, and not so much the military history. So the College Board does not stress that, so you're not really going to get that here. I know many of you might enjoy it, but we got to do what the College Board wants us to do. So here we go. So one thing you need to keep in mind, and this kind of carries over from what we studied before and kind of the causes of World War II, the lead up to it, is that the United States is framing our participation in the war as a fight against oppression in the name of freedom. All right? We're doing that because of the way we look at kind of Nazi Germany and fascism, totalitarianism, militarism, taking over Europe, taking over the world, and getting rid of liberty and freedom in the process. Okay, so these are the reasons we went to the war, and it became sort of clear after the war that many of these things were going on. So of course there's political reasons and economic reasons why we got involved in the war, but these kind of grand ideas for why we were there really did correlate to what happened in the war itself. Specifically on the left it mentions Japanese wartime atrocities and the Holocaust. So let's look at those two things. So the Holocaust first. Hopefully you study this a lot in AP Euro or World History. It's not a big focus of here, but we want to focus on what the U.S. knew, what they did, and what they did not do. So we know that this is, of course, the case of the Nazis killing 6 million Jews and other people too. So people who were of Slavic descent, people who were gay, people who had physical deformities, who had mental diseases. All these people were killed in the name of creating some master race. And this is going on throughout Europe during World War II, and it gave credence to our cause. So it happened, so it should be clear, well, we went in to fight for freedom, but we need to recognize some other stuff, is that we knew it was going on, and we did very little about it during the war. We had our reasons, but of course, hindsight is 20/20, so when we look back, it's hard to kind of sort of come to terms with the fact that we knew this sort of atrocity was happening and did nothing about it. So one reason we did nothing about it is the government was worried of what would happen if we did take action. So think of this. So what if we knew where the concentration camps were and we bombed them? What would happen? Would the Nazis just go and immediately go kill all the other people in the death camps? We weren't sure what the sort of reaction would be by Nazi Germany if we attacked directly. Okay, other things, we could have bombed the trains there, the railroads there to prevent people from getting to the camps, but then that would have directed supplies away from our main sort of battles. It would have sort of made it clear to the Nazis that we knew what was going on, and again, we weren't clear, so we did nothing about it until the very end, until it was clear we were going to win. Now, another aspect of the Holocaust is people say, well, we could have allowed refugees into the U.S., and many ships did show up to the U.S. from Europe before the war began looking for refuge, looking for asylum. A clear example of this was the MS St. Louis that came all the way. It had mostly sort of German Jews on there, and it went down to Florida, wasn't allowed to land. Okay, FDR said he didn't want to set a precedent for allowing other refugees to come. They went down to Cuba. They were not allowed entry there either. And so what happened? They had to go back to Europe, and many European countries took in these Jewish refugees, but still I think it was like 80 or 90% of the people on that ship ended up dying in concentration camps anyway. Okay, so keep in mind that we had some very strategic political things going on that prevented us from actually preventing some of this from happening in the first place. Now, here's kind of a bad thing on top of all of this, is that most Americans just didn't care. There were still widespread anti-Semitism in the U.S. In fact, there was kind of like a budding Nazi party in the U.S. as well. They had a big rally at Madison Square Gardens during the lead up to the war. So yes, we were fighting for freedom when we joined the war, but also, yes, we did nothing to stop these sort of atrocities against freedom and religious freedom during the lead up to the war, mostly due to apathy and government inaction. All right, now the other theater of the war against Japan. So something that represents that those Japanese wartime atrocities mentioned there is the Bataan Death March. So this has to do with an American surrender of troops in the Philippines. The Philippines was the first place that Americans went to after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Remember, the Philippines still had a connection to the United States. Remember, we bought it during the outcome of the Spanish-American War. It was ours. We were kind of in control, kind of not in control, but it was a good place for us to go and sort of station all our troops, but Japan had taken it over. Okay, so we wanted to liberate that first and use it as a strategic point for fighting the war against Japan. But what happened? The U.S. was not ready to fight this war. It was the largest surrender of troops in U.S. history, 75,000 troops, and almost all of them were forced to basically walk to POW camps, I think it was like about 60 miles away. But they're marching through dense jungle, not provided with food and water. Basically, the Japanese were just hoping that their prisoners of war would die along the way. So that's why they forced them to go on this march. If they sort of fell along the way, they were just left to die. If they tried to stop to catch their breath, they were executed. So it represents kind of this very extreme tactics used by the Japanese during the war, and sort of this support for why we had to fight them. So clearly this militarist sort of mindset was putting the Japanese in a place to commit wartime atrocities, and we were fighting against that, is kind of the lens that we look at for why the U.S. got involved in the war. All right, so next up we had to talk about what's going on at home with mobilizing for war. Now, you need to remember that the Great Depression was still going on when the war began, and it is our participation in the war that ultimately ends the Great Depression. So it is not the New Deal that ends it, it is World War II that ends the war. Now, mass mobilization means that all parts of society contribute to total war. This happened when we were in World War I, it happened during our Civil War as well, and we're going to see this happen during World War II. The government does a few things. One thing they do goes in line with the New Deal as it was before, was increasing income tax. So the Revenue Act of 1942 was going to use income tax to finance the war, and what it resulted in is that it used to be only the people who were very wealthy had to pay an income tax. Now they're kind of lowering the threshold for how much you make per year for qualifying to having to pay income tax. It meant 10 times as many Americans would have to pay income tax as before. So you can see that's just a way to raise money in the first place. Another thing is industry shifting production. So industries before would be making things to promote their economy, to promote consumerism, but during wartime, you've got to focus on what is needed by the war. So companies like Ford and General Motors would be making planes and tanks instead of cars. And you can see many different industries have to shift over the use of their factories to what the war needs rather than what their company needs for a profit. So in general as well, just the increase in production of all these different goods leads to the end of the production. Because we have such a high economic output because of the war, we get out of the depression, we go into an expansion, and actually if you look at a chart of this, you can see that this expansion is really unprecedented than ever before. We get beyond any output that our country had been making in terms of the economy than ever before. Okay, lots of Americans willingly join the armed services, so that includes men, women, and minorities as well. So a few different things about this. So it's mostly that white men that are going to fight on the main lines. Some men of color were fighting in the war itself as well, but there were still segregated units. So black and whites were not fighting alongside each other. Two of the major segregated units that are well known from World War II are the Tuskegee Airmen and the Navajo Code Talkers. The Tuskegee Airmen were African Americans, and they're named after the Tuskegee Institute. Right, so if you remember, that was a college, basically a technical, vocational skilled college founded by Booker T. Washington back during the Jim Crow era. All right, the other one are the Navajo Code Talkers. These were Native Americans from the Navajo, and there were so few Navajo that actually spoke their language still that they used these few people as translators as to code all our messages. So they would have Navajo at different stations, and when messages had to be communicated, they would just do it in the Navajo language, and then the person at the other end would just translate it into English. And because Navajo had no similar languages anywhere in the world, no one was ever able to decode it. Okay? As for women, women did contribute to the war effort and in the military as well, but it was in communications or clerical work. So there were not women on the front lines. There were some female nurses, but most of them were just working on military bases back home in the United States. So my grandma, how old was she? So she would have been 17, 18 when the war was still going on, just graduated high school. She worked for the Navy, and she basically worked in this part of some building that had what she called a computer. And this computer was, of course, an entire room large, and she said she basically had to not translate, but sort of transport and move along things that the computer was putting out. She said she had no idea what it was, but she was contributing to the effort somehow. Right? Realize that most of these people joining the military are doing so willingly, but there was a draft all the same. So people wanted to join, but even if they didn't, in many cases they were required to. Okay, what else is going on with mass mobilization? Labor unions. Now, if you remember, during the Great Depression, there is more support for labor unions, right? There's the Wagner Act that basically gives government support for unions, saying that people can't be fired because they're trying to unionize. But the goals have changed now, and what that means is that the unions can be regulated by the government for how much they're asking for, their hours, their conditions, and this was done through something called the National War Labor Board. Basically, strikes were prohibited, and it was controlled so that the interest of labor would not supersede the interests of the country in fighting the war. So you can see it's kind of a balance here. On the one hand, you have, yes, the Great Depression and the New Deal got more support for labor unions, but at the same time, the war kind of decreased that a little bit. So it's kind of like an ebb and a flow thing going on. Lastly, something that affected absolutely everyone was rationing. So rationing is the idea of goods have to be conserved from consumption during the war. And what this means is that stamps were issued in order to limit how much food and goods were being consumed. So not just food, things like gas, clothing, all these things that were going to be used for the war effort and not for personal consumption. Now, so the way this worked is people always ask, you still had to pay money for it, but you also had these stamps, and you could only buy so much of things like, let's say, like butter and flour and sugar and milk and eggs per week or per month. So you turned in the stamp plus the money to pay for it. So it was the way the government was regulating consumption. Now, there were ways around this if you were very wealthy. There was a black market for goods, but it was uncommon during the time period. All right, so more about mobilization and what the effect of mobilization is going to have on issues at home. So not just the fact that everyone's contributing in their own way, but considering what happens with minorities and women and civil rights issues and segregation. All these were going on in America at the time, and the war is going to have a major effect on changing how those operated within the United States. So women were having a greater presence in the workforce and in the military because men were fighting abroad. Now, the greatest image of this is Rosie the Riveter, still very famous to this day, on the right. So the idea is that not only were women working in industrial industries as riveters, as making planes and all these jobs that were considered male jobs before, it's actually being encouraged through propaganda like Rosie the Riveter. And that needs to show you something. It shows that through World War II, not only is it just acceptable that women are in the workforce, it is encouraged. And that's going to have a major sort of mindset shift for women. Women are going to come out of World War II saying, wait, I'm just supposed to go back home and, cook and clean again? No, I was contributing during the war effort. If I could do it then, I can still do it now. One thing to realize, of course, is they still were being paid less because of the pay gap than what men would have had, but it still shifts their mindset that's going to have major ramifications after the war. Right? The other thing to talk about is civil rights issues during World War II. Now, we're going to see some things going on with African Americans, some things with Mexican Americans, and some things most critically with Japanese Americans as well. World War II is going to change our policies through different things, in some ways in good ways, in some ways in bad ways as well. Okay, so FDR made a few executive orders during World War II in order to deal with civil rights and the war. Executive Order 8022 declared the desegregation of wartime industries. Now, think of a couple reasons he's doing this. He's doing this for one reason is because men are starting to go off to war. And what that means is there is a need for workers within wartime industries. White women are filling the role, but FDR wants to make it clear that industries can't discriminate against black Americans as they had been doing before. So it desegregated that way. But there is another side to this too. One reason FDR desegregated is because African American civil rights leaders were putting pressure on the administration to do it. And what they basically said is, you need to desegregate the wartime industries, do something about this, fight for civil rights with us, or we're going to march on Washington. And FDR said, don't do that. That goes against the war effort. And they said, well, we want to contribute, but society won't let us. So FDR was pressured into doing this through a threatened march on Washington, and this was part of what was called the Double V campaign. V for victory. Victory abroad in the war, and victory at home for civil rights. Okay? Now realize that this Double V campaign didn't really go anywhere. Okay, so we're going to find in the 1950s that civil rights issues kind of revert to the way they were before the war. But it's kind of like with women. It's kind of this spark to this idea of, if we could be more equal during wartime, why can't we be more equal or equally equal during peacetime? And what that's going to do is it's going to help to create the civil rights movement when we get to it in the 1950s and 1960s, with key leaders like A. Philip Randolph, who was the one who was trying to make that march happen. All right, something else going on with civil rights is the violation of those civil rights, and that's through another executive order, 9066, Japanese American internment. Before I tell you about it, I want you to notice something. Executive orders can be used for good things and for bad things. They can be used to desegregate wartime industries. They can be used to put people in concentration camps. Okay, so don't always view them as a good thing or a bad thing. They can be used for both. Right, so what was happening is there was this widespread fear of Americans of Japanese descent and what would happen if we went to war with Japan as they lived on the West Coast. There was this fear from society and the government that people of Japanese descent would favor Japan in the war instead of favoring the American government. Now, these camps didn't really happen, but that fear still existed back during World War I with people of German and Italian descent. That's even the reason if you go to Great Britain, while the royal family changed their sort of name of their house to Windsor from, I think it's like Saxe-Coburg, like it was a German name, and they said, we don't want to look German, so they changed their name. Okay? So this fear exists, and what it led to is basically putting anyone of Japanese descent into relocation, but really concentration camps out on the West Coast and away from the coast. Now, most of these people were American citizens. They were not from Japan. They were the children of Japanese immigrants. So keep this in mind. They were American citizens. So it's not even the issue if they were immigrants and do they have as many civil rights. They absolutely had these civil liberties from the Constitution, and they were denied them. They were basically denied their due process of law because they were imprisoned, so denied their freedom without their day in court. They'd done nothing except be of Japanese descent. Now, it was challenged in the Supreme Court in its own time with the case Korematsu versus the United States. Fred Korematsu had evaded imprisonment, and eventually he went on to challenge it in the court, but the Supreme Court upheld the executive order saying that it was okay to deny civil rights during wartime. And this is something you need to know, that are they really rights, like the Bill of Rights, if the government can deny them to you? And the answer is not really. They're more privileges that the government permits us most of the time. Okay? The government eventually reverses its policy, offers an apology and reparations to those put into these concentration camps in the 1980s. But many felt it was too little too late. Lots of them lost their businesses. Lots of them lost their entire livelihood. Many were killed for trying to escape. Um, so keep this in mind of one of these things in wartime that we have to question. We have to question our government and what they're doing. Was it really about protecting freedom and liberty if people's freedom and liberty, Americans' freedom and liberty, was denied to them in the process? Some would say you have to make wartime sacrifices. Others say that your rights, your sort of inalienable rights, are never something you should sacrifice because it's the government they're protecting you from. Your choice. Right? One last thing was something happening on the West Coast was something that were called the Zoot Suit Riots. And again, this revealed the limits of racial harmony during wartime. What this was, it was violence between the military and Mexican youth, or Mexican American youth living in mostly LA. Now, what was happening is LA was a big port for deployment for troops, and it was also where they would come back. And what happened is a lot of white people in the military, white men, would come home and see that there was kind of a lot of Latino youth that weren't serving, that they were kind of wearing this very specific type of clothing called zoot suits. They're kind of like very colorful and stylized and over large, and that made these sort of white servicemen very angry, and it led them to sort of taking violence against people of Mexican descent, and then sort of riots in the streets for days. Eventually they die down, but it just reveals that if it felt like you weren't supporting wartime unity, then you were going to face negative consequences, and race played into that as well. All right, sorry guys, I'm still sick. I'm working on it. All right, so this is the slide where we are going to get into sort of the military side of the war. So they only put it on one slide. There's only a few things you really need to know for American history regarding the war. So here we, war battles, I should say. Here we go. Okay, first we're going to look at Europe. One term you need to know is the big three, or the Allied powers: the US, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. The big three is also the term used for the main three leaders for that: FDR, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, respectively. Okay, the Soviet Union eventually joins the Allied side after Hitler violates their non-aggression pact. So that's why they're on the American side, the Allied side. Okay, so the Soviets are fighting Germany on the Eastern Front. Basically, Germany goes to invade the Soviet Union when they break their non-aggression pact. But the Soviets fight back a lot. They fight back very adamantly. In fact, the Soviet Union has some of the largest deaths of the entire war. The biggest war on the Eastern Front is the Battle of Stalingrad. So this was a city that was a big industrial center and also a transportation hub. The Germans were looking to get a hold of it so they could further their campaign further east and have kind of a central location for operating everything out there. But what happens is, after several months, this was a very long battle, lots of deaths on both sides, the Soviets win and start to push them back towards Western Europe. And this sort of is all I'm going to talk about the Eastern Front. Okay, Hitler invades, the Soviets push back, and is basically chasing them back the entire way. The Western Front is a bit more complicated because it had various steps. Okay, now we with the UK opened up the Western Front in France after previous successes in North Africa and Italy. Initially, we went to North Africa to get it as a staging area to invade Europe from below. Eventually, we get into Italy, but we get kind of stalled there along the Italian peninsula, and it doesn't go anywhere. So we open up France in the north, still have Italy in the south, hoping to close in on Germany as the Soviets close in from the east to surround Germany. Now, notice it's in red on the left, so it's something you need to know, was D-Day. So the Normandy invasions, also known as Operation Overlord, happened on June 6, 1944. And it's a huge operation of American, British, and Canadian forces to take over northern France, to liberate Paris, and then to start to move westward. So it's successful. It's one of the largest campaigns of the Western Front. Okay, so what's going on? You just need to know the general progression of the US and the UK are in the west, the Soviets are in the east. We eventually get some success in Italy as well, as fascist Italy falls. They even kill Mussolini on their own. What happens is we are closing in on Germany and Berlin. It was really just the question of, was the Soviet Union going to reach it first, or were we going to reach there first? Eventually, when it became clear that that Berlin was surrounded. Hitler commits suicide. Other Nazi leaders do too. And that's kind of it on the war in Europe. Okay? Surrounding them on multiple fronts and closing in. Meanwhile, the war in the Pacific, the thing you need to know, two things that are mentioned over there. One is the island hopping strategy. So obviously, with the war in the Pacific, it's on this gigantic ocean. So what that means is you can't really sort of station things along land and then move in and close in. You have to figure out a different strategy. So what we did instead is we figured out, let's stop the Japanese advance. We did that, I think, at the Battle of Coral Sea in Midway. And then once we control those, let's start controlling major islands closer and closer, so eventually we control the islands around Japan, and then we can have a sort of use air attacks on the Japanese mainland before we have an invasion on the land. Okay? Major places in the island hopping strategy: Midway, Coral Sea, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Now, the thing is, with Okinawa, we figured out that the war was not going to be easily ended. It took much longer than we thought, with a lot more sort of ferocious resistance from the Japanese civilians and military. Okay, an overall thing to know about the war in the Pacific: it was very harsh and had this kind of alien landscape. It sort of didn't look like a normal war people were used to. It wasn't like you were on land with hills and you had, sort of the enemy laid out before you. It was on the ocean. There was no signs of civilization, which meant that it was kind of easier for men to lose their humanity and get involved in wartime atrocities. So I mentioned before the things the Japanese did to us in the Bataan Death March. We were doing similar things to the Japanese. We were taking their heads and ears and teeth as souvenirs, and you have to ask, what would lead someone to actually do those sort of atrocious acts? It has to do with the fact that war has a large psychological effect, not just a physical effect on those fighting it. So the Pacific War is very relevant to that. All right, major thing you need to know, and we'll cover this in class, has to do with the Pacific and the use of the atomic bomb that eventually ends the war. Context: so before this, the United States was attempting to develop nuclear weapons back in New Mexico because Germany was already trying to develop them. We knew they were developing it, and we thought, if they make it first, they will use it on us, so we need to make the weapon before they do, as kind of deterrence for them actually using it. Well, we defeat Germany before either of us make the bomb, so Germany's not in the race anymore. The United States decides to continue making it. We successfully test it in July 1945, while the new President Truman was actually negotiating sort of the treaty to end the war in Europe. And it is used the next month twice in Japan, at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, what was going on again is we didn't want to have a large-scale land invasion of Japan because of what we saw that happened at Okinawa, sort of lots of resistance. So what we decided instead is, let's warn them to surrender unconditionally, or else. Well, they didn't surrender unconditionally. The condition they wanted was to keep their emperor, and we said no, so we bombed Hiroshima. Right? We'll look at kind of the effects and what this was like in class. Okay? So after that, they still didn't surrender unconditionally, so we bombed Nagasaki, and then they surrendered unconditionally. Now, what we had to consider is there could be high human cost of a land invasion. On the other side, we were using a technology against a side that didn't have it, and you have to consider that during wartime, if you're using standard warfare, there's sort of this equality to war, right? The argument against it is that, look what we did when they couldn't have sort of a parity with that issue. We're going to look at the arguments for and against it in class, so if I haven't covered this properly, it's okay. We're going to do it more in class. Also in class, ask me to tell you more about just how the technology and how the science works behind nuclear weapons. Okay? No time right now. All right, so sorry guys, I'm nursing this cold and it's absolutely horrible. So the United States wins the war with our allies, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. Now, the fact that the Soviet Union is our ally is causing us problems because remember, they are a totalitarian government, right? We were supposed to be fighting this war for liberty, but the Soviet Union's approach to government is very much anti-liberty and anti-freedom. But it was a sort of marriage of convenience, of necessity. So, the very last meeting between the big three, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, happens in Yalta, which is, I think, somewhere on the Black Sea in the Soviet Union. What were they arguing? FDR wanted self-determination for new countries. He's telling people like Stalin who wanted satellite communist governments on the countries that bordered him, he's saying, no, if they want to be communist, they can decide that, but we want democracy for them so they can decide what their new form of government will be. Now, if you remember, this was an argument after World War I as well, the argument that these nationalist movements need to have their voice in their land, in their country. Okay, and that happened in Europe, and this is kind of looking to continue that tradition. Stalin refuses to agree to it, so it doesn't happen. Something else they agreed to is that once Germany fell, it would be divided into 4 Allied-controlled sections, one controlled by the US, one controlled by Britain, one controlled by France, and one controlled by the Soviet Union in the East. That's going to lead to some problems later on once we get into the Cold War. The other thing they decided, there needed to be a new international peacekeeping body. So the United Nations replaces the League of Nations, and the U.S. is now playing a central role there. Remember, we weren't in the League of Nations, and the United Nations put the Allied powers that won in positions of power. So there's actually 5 countries to this day on the Security Council. And if they veto something, the entire thing dies. So those countries are the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. Okay, these still, basically I'm just trying to tell you that these World War II alliances still have ramifications to this very day, even though some of those countries are completely different countries than what they were when World War II ended. All right, now this isn't the last meeting about the end of the war though. The final one was Potsdam, which is outside of Berlin in Germany. Now, between Yalta and Potsdam, FDR had died. So he died of natural causes. He was getting his portrait painted, and he was already in very, very poor health. It was not unexpected that he died. So he dies in April 1945. His vice president, Harry Truman, replaces him. England also gets a new prime minister. They decide that Churchill was a great wartime minister, but it was peacetime now, and they didn't need him anymore. But what that means is that the next meeting between these big 3 countries, Stalin is the only one left from before, and he's going to basically flex his power and not go along with Britain and America anymore. He's kind of foreseeing the Cold War to come. So he will not allow self-determination. He was worrying about U.S. influence in Eastern Europe, and this leads to the creation of the Iron Curtain. You can kind of see that on the map to the right. It's the division between the countries that are in blue that support kind of capitalism and democracy, and countries that support communism in the East. So we're going to talk about that more in period 8. Okay. So just realize that another reason we used the atomic bomb was to keep the Soviets out of the Pacific theater. So they were not in the Pacific War or had not declared war on Japan. So that means that they didn't have a say in the rebuilding of Japan. We're the only country there that sort of helps to write their new constitution. And that's why Japan doesn't really play a role in the Cold War. So, things you need to take away from this. World War II isn't even over yet, but the Cold War divisions have already begun to emerge. Okay, Western democracies versus Eastern communism. World War II's results also solidify which powers will be in control of the world and have more influence for the rest of the century. So all the way through the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. So keep this in mind. Keep in mind what are the large-scale effects of World War II on international relations, on civil rights at home, on gender roles at home. That's why this is what we're really focusing on here. Not so much the nitty-gritty of what's happening in these battles. That's kind of tedious and it's minutia. What you need to be thinking about are these large trends that are going to have causes and effects leading into our next historical period with the Cold War. All right, thank you so much for watching, guys. Hopefully you watched this one on 1.25 speed, at least, because I was probably talking slow from being sick. I'll have to re-record this one later. Whatever. You still got work to do. Terms to do on some cards, quiz to do, geography to work on, chronology to study, and then period 8 if you're ready to go. All right, so this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in class. Bye.